The house was quiet when Mara moved in, far quieter than she was used to. Her last apartment had been in the city, a cacophony of car horns, muffled arguments, and the occasional police siren, all softened only slightly by the thin walls. The stillness of this place felt unnatural, almost sterile. She had rented it in a rush, after a breakup and a need to escape, and the price was too good to ignore. It was an old place, a bit creaky, but charming in its way. The landlord, a wiry man with nervous hands, had only one rule: don't worry about the basement. It stays locked. At first she barely noticed the door. It was painted the same off-white as the rest of the walls, tucked into a narrow hallway near the kitchen. Mara had little use for it anyway. She figured it was just an old storage space, or a crawl space, maybe not even safe to go down there. She had no desire to deal with cobwebs and stale air, so she let it be. But after about a week she began to notice the noises. They weren't loud or constant, just occasional dull thuds. At first she assumed it was something outside, a loose branch hitting the house. Perhaps, but the sounds always seemed to come from the same place, right beneath her feet. Late at night, when the house seemed to lean into its silence, the noises grew harder to ignore. One evening she pressed her ear to the basement door. The sound was faint, like something heavy shifting slightly on concrete. She knocked on the door impulsively, expecting only her echo, but the noise immediately stopped. The silence that followed felt weighty, oppressive. She told herself it was her imagination, probably the house settling. Old houses did that, right? But the way her pulse quickened and her breath caught in her chest told a different story. When the landlord came by to check the boiler a few days later, she casually brought it up. He tensed immediately, his smile growing tight. "It's an old house," he said, too quickly. "It makes noises sometimes, don't worry about it. The basement's locked for a reason. It's just not safe." His tone left no room for argument, and Mara didn't press further, though the interaction left her uneasy. That night the noises seemed louder, closer. It wasn't just thuds now. There was a faint, rhythmic tapping, like knuckles rapping against wood. She stayed up late, the light from the TV casting jittery shadows across the room. Every time she began to drift off, another noise would jar her awake. She told herself it was nothing, but deep down, she knew she wouldn't be able to ignore it forever. Days turned into weeks, and the house's oddities became harder to dismiss. Small things began to go missing: her keys, a coffee mug, a scarf she swore she'd left on the couch. Sometimes she'd find them later, in places she was certain she hadn't put them. The noises from the basement grew more frequent, their patterns stranger. Once she thought she heard whispering, but it was so faint and so brief she couldn't be sure. She stopped sleeping well, her dreams filled with images of dark, twisting staircases and the sense of being watched. One afternoon she finally called the landlord. She didn't know what she was going to say, only that she couldn't keep living like this. To her surprise, he agreed to come over. When he arrived, he had the same tense energy as before, his eyes darting nervously around the house, as if he expected something to jump out at him. She pointed to the basement door. "I can't take it anymore," she said, her voice trembling. "I need to know what's down there." He hesitated for what felt like an eternity before pulling a small, tarnished key from his pocket. "I don't normally do this," he said, his voice low. "But if you really want to see, it's on you." He handed her the key and left without another word. Mara stood there for a long time, staring at the key in her palm. It felt heavier than it should have, its edges cold and sharp against her skin. That evening, after pouring herself a stiff drink and summoning all her courage, she unlocked the door. The hinges groaned as it swung open, revealing a steep wooden staircase leading into darkness. The air that wafted up was damp and smelled faintly of mildew, with an undercurrent of something metallic. She flicked on the light switch at the top of the stairs, but nothing happened. After a moment of hesitation, she grabbed a flashlight and started down. The stairs creaked under her weight, and the darkness seemed to press in around her. The beam of the flashlight revealed a plain concrete floor at the bottom, bare walls, and nothing else. The room was smaller than she'd expected, its dimensions not matching the footprint of the house above. She frowned, shining the light around the corners. It was empty, completely unremarkable, but something about it felt wrong. The air was heavy, almost oppressive, and the silence was absolute. Even her own breathing seemed muffled. She climbed back up, locking the door behind her. For a moment she felt silly she'd built it up in her head, let her imagination run wild. But later that night, as she lay in bed, she realized something that sent a chill through her. The staircase had been shorter than it should have been. She'd counted the steps 10 in total, but when she looked at the house from the outside, the basement should have gone deeper. The next day she went down again, determined to make sense of it. This time the staircase led to a slightly different room. It was still bare and empty, but the layout had changed. There was a corner now, where none had been before, and the air felt even thicker. She walked the perimeter, running her hand along the rough concrete walls. When she reached the new corner, she stopped. The flashlight flickered for a moment, and she thought she heard something, a faint scraping sound, like nails dragging across stone. She spun around, but the room was empty. Each time she went back, the basement was different. Sometimes the walls seemed closer, the ceiling lower. Other times the room stretched impossibly far, the flashlight beam unable to reach the farthest edges. The changes were subtle at first, but they grew more pronounced. One day she found what looked like a doorway in one of the walls, but it led only to a blank expanse of concrete. Another time the room was filled with an earthy smell, as though something had recently been dug up. The noises grew louder and more frequent, no longer confined to the night. Once she thought she saw movement in the shadows, a flicker of something too fast to identify. Her nerves were fraying, and she started leaving all the lights in the house on, even during the day. But the lights didn't help. If anything, they seemed to make the shadows deeper. One evening, as she descended the stairs, she noticed something new. In the farthest corner of the basement, where the shadows pooled thickest, there was a small, dark stain on the floor. It looked wet, glistening faintly in the flashlight's beam. She didn't dare touch it, but she couldn't tear her eyes away. That night, the noises were louder than ever, accompanied by faint, irregular tapping against the inside of the basement door. Mara barely slept that night. The tapping against the basement door was irregular, almost teasing, like it was testing her resolve. It would stop for long stretches, lulling her into a false sense of security, only to start up again just as her eyes began to close. Her chest tightened every time the sound came back. By morning she was a mess of frayed nerves and restless energy, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't quite articulate. She told herself she'd had enough, that she'd leave the house, call the landlord, get far away, but when daylight came, she couldn't bring herself to leave. Something kept her rooted. She spent the day pacing, avoiding the basement door like it was a living thing. She didn't eat. She didn't shower. The hours blurred together until it was dark again, and with the darkness came the noises. This time it wasn't just tapping. There were faint creaks, the sound of shifting weight, and something else, a low, guttural sound she couldn't quite place. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't human, either. It made her stomach twist into knots just to hear it. She didn't know what compelled her to go back down. Maybe it was the exhaustion, the need to prove to herself that it was all in her head. Maybe it was the gnawing curiosity, the sense that whatever was down there wouldn't stop until she confronted it. Whatever the reason, she found herself standing in front of the basement door just past midnight, flashlight in hand, key trembling between her fingers. The air hit her like a wall as she opened the door, a damp, cold gust that carried with it the faint metallic tang she was beginning to associate with the basement. She hesitated at the top of the stairs, her pulse pounding in her ears. The flashlight flickered again as she descended, the beam struggling against the oppressive darkness. The room was different again. Larger this time, impossibly so. The far wall was barely visible, swallowed by shadows that seemed to shift and writhe when she looked at them directly. The floor was uneven, sloping slightly downward toward the farthest corner, where the wet stain had been the last time. Now, the stain was larger, spreading out in jagged, branching patterns that looked almost deliberate, like veins. The smell was stronger, too, a cloying mix of earth and decay. She moved slowly, her breath shallow and her hands shaking so hard she could barely keep the flashlight steady. As she approached the corner, she saw something new, a small object lying just at the edge of the stain. It was a key, identical to the one she held in her hand, except this one was stained dark with something that looked like rust but smelled like blood. She bent down to pick it up, and as her fingers closed around it, she heard a sound behind her. It was soft at first, like the faint rustle of fabric, but it grew louder, more distinct. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, impossibly heavy for how soft they sounded. She spun around, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. but there was nothing there, only the empty room and the staircase leading back up. The footsteps stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. It wasn't empty silence, it was a silence that felt full, as though something was holding its breath, waiting. Her heart was racing now, every instinct screaming at her to leave, to run, to never come back. But when she turned to head back up the stairs, the flashlight beam caught something she hadn't noticed before. There was a door embedded in the far wall, its edges warped and uneven, as though it had been hastily carved out of the concrete. It hadn't been there before she was sure of it, but now it loomed in front of her, its surface slick with moisture. She didn't want to open it, every fiber of her being told her not to. But the key in her hand seemed to pulse, almost imperceptibly, as though urging her forward. Her legs felt like they weren't her own as she crossed the room, the flashlight beam quivering against the door's surface. She reached out with the key, her fingers trembling so violently she almost dropped it. The moment the key slid into the lock, the noises started again, louder this time, closer. The tapping, the creaks, the low guttural sounds, all blending together into a cacophony that made her head spin. The door swung open on its own, the hinges groaning like a dying animal. The room beyond was pitch black, the flashlight's beam swallowed entirely as soon as it crossed the threshold. The air was colder here, almost freezing, and the smell was overpowering. She stepped forward, one shaky foot at a time, the floor beneath her soft and yielding, like packed dirt. As she moved deeper into the room, her flashlight flickered again, and for a brief moment she saw something a shape, hunched and wrong, its limbs too long, its limbs too long, its proportions distorted. It wasn't facing her, but it was moving, its body jerking and twitching as though it was struggling to stand. The light went out completely then, plunging her into darkness. Her breath caught in her throat as she fumbled with the flashlight, smacking it against her palm in a desperate attempt to bring it back to life. When it flickered on again, the room was empty. The shape was gone. But she could feel it now, the weight of its presence pressing down on her from all sides. The floor beneath her shifted slightly, and she realized, with a sickening lurch, that it wasn't dirt she was standing on. It was flesh, warm and pulsing faintly under her feet. The flashlight went out again. This time it didn't come back on. The darkness closed in around her, thick and absolute, like something tangible. She tried to move, to step back toward the door, but her feet felt glued to the floor. The sensation beneath her was nauseating, soft, warm and rhythmic, as though it were breathing, faintly alive. Her stomach churned, and she stifled a scream that bubbled up in her throat. Then, from the oppressive silence, came a sound. It wasn't a thud, a creak, or the guttural noises she'd heard before. This was a voice, low and rasping. It whispered her name. Mara. Her blood turned to ice. The voice wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. It echoed, bouncing off unseen walls, surrounding her. The way it said her name was wrong, stretching the syllables like a twisted mockery of familiarity. She clutched the dead flashlight like a weapon, her knuckles white, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. Mara. It came again, closer this time. She could feel the weight of it, vibrating through the pulsing floor beneath her feet. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to obey. Her legs were leaden, her arms trembling. The air felt heavier now, as if the room itself was alive and pressing in on her. The voice spoke again, but it wasn't her name this time. It was something else, a string of words she couldn't understand. The language was guttural, alien, each syllable sending a sharp, searing pain through her skull. She dropped the flashlight and clutched her head, the sound reverberating inside her like a hammer. Tears streamed down her face as she tried to block it out, but the words only grew louder, more insistent. And then it stopped. The silence that followed was so sudden and complete it felt like she'd gone deaf. She opened her eyes, though she didn't remember closing them, and realized she could see now, not clearly, but enough to make out faint shapes in the dark. The room wasn't empty anymore. They were all around her, barely visible but unmistakable. Shapes, humanoid but wrong, their limbs too long, their heads tilted at unnatural angles. Their eyes, or where their eyes should have been, glimmered faintly, catching some unseen light. They stood still, watching her, their forms wavering like shadows cast by an unsteady flame. One of them moved, a slow, jerking step forward, and Mara finally found her voice. She screamed, a raw, piercing sound that echoed endlessly in the dark. The shapes didn't react. They didn't flinch or move closer. They only watched, their heads tilting slightly in unison, as if studying her. She stumbled backward, her foot catching on the uneven ground, and fell hard onto her hands and knees. The surface beneath her pulsed against her palms, a sickening, wet sensation that made her gag. She scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst, and turned toward where she thought the door had been. It wasn't there. The doorway was gone, replaced by smooth, featureless walls that stretched endlessly in all directions. The shapes surrounded her now, closer than before, their forms more distinct. She could see their mouths wide, too wide, filled with jagged, uneven teeth. They weren't smiling, exactly, but the way their lips curled back felt like mockery. The voice came again, louder this time, filling the space around her. It didn't speak her name anymore. It spoke words that twisted in her mind, carving themselves into her thoughts like claw marks. She felt something warm trickling from her nose and realized she was bleeding. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the voice stopped. The shapes retreated, melting back into the shadows, their glimmering eyes the last to disappear. The room was silent again, the oppressive weight lifting slightly. Mara stood there, shaking, her mind racing to make sense of what she'd just seen. Before she could fully process it, the ground beneath her shifted. It wasn't a subtle movement this time, it lurched violently, throwing her off balance. She hit the floor hard, the air knocked from her lungs, and before she could scramble to her feet, the ground gave way entirely. She was falling now, the air rushing past her in a deafening roar. She couldn't see, couldn't think, only feel the sickening sensation of weightlessness, the darkness swallowing her whole. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the fall ended. She hit something solid but soft, like the floor she'd been standing on before, and lay there for a moment dazed. The air down here was colder, the smell stronger, almost unbearable. When she opened her eyes, she realized she wasn't in the same room anymore. This place was larger, cavernous, the walls sloping upward into an endless void. The faint light that had allowed her to see before was gone entirely, replaced by a deeper, more absolute darkness. But she wasn't alone. She could hear them moving now, the shapes, their footsteps soft but deliberate, circling her. And in the distance she heard it. The voice, not a whisper this time, but a deep, rumbling sound that shook the ground beneath her. It wasn't speaking now, it was laughing. The laughter echoed on, growing louder, surrounding her like a living thing. It vibrated through the cavernous space, deep and guttural, rattling her teeth and pressing against her chest like an invisible weight. She scrambled to her feet, her muscles screaming in protest, and turned wildly, searching for a direction to run, but there was no escape. The sound was everywhere. The ground beneath her shifted again, undulating like the surface of a living creature. She stumbled, catching herself on her hands, and realized with horror that the surface was moving. The faintly pulsing texture she'd felt before was now unmistakable. It wasn't just alive, it was breathing. Slow, rhythmic waves rippled beneath her palms, each exhalation filling the air with the smell of decay and damp earth. She forced herself to stand, her legs trembling, and began to move. There was no clear path, no landmarks to orient herself by, but standing still felt worse. The laughter faded slowly, replaced by a low, guttural hum that reverberated through the air, like the growl of some enormous predator. It came from everywhere and nowhere, urging her forward. The faint shapes returned, moving at the edges of her vision. They were closer now, their forms more distinct. She could see the glint of their two wide mouths, the jagged edges of their teeth. They moved silently, their limbs jerking in unnatural, spasmodic motions. They weren't coming for her, not yet, but they were there, surrounding her, herding her. She didn't know how long she walked. Time felt meaningless in this place. The oppressive darkness pressed against her like a physical thing, and the faint shape seemed to multiply with every step. The low hum grew louder, more insistent, and she felt herself being drawn toward it despite every instinct screaming at her to turn back. Then she saw it. At first it was just a faint glow, barely visible against the crushing darkness. But as she moved closer, it grew brighter, casting long, flickering shadows across the cavern. The light came from a massive, jagged structure in the center of the room, its surface slick and glistening. It wasn't made of stone or metal, it was organic, pulsating faintly like a giant, breathing heart. The hum was coming from it, deep and resonant, vibrating through the air like a chant. Symbols were etched into its surface, their jagged lines glowing faintly with the same sickly light. Mara couldn't read them, but just looking at them made her head ache, the words carving themselves into her thoughts like burning brands. The shapes were closer now, circling the structure, their movements almost reverent. They didn't seem to notice her anymore, their attention fixed on the pulsing monolith. As she stepped closer, the ground beneath her began to shift again, the soft, pulsing surface growing firmer, rougher. She realized with dawning horror that it was forming a path, leading her directly to the glowing structure. She tried to stop, to turn back, but her feet refused to obey. Her legs moved of their own accord, carrying her forward, even as her mind screamed at her to run. The hum grew louder with every step, a deafening chorus that filled her head, drowning out her thoughts. When she reached the base of the structure, she realized just how massive it was. It towered above her, its surface slick and glistening, the glowing symbols twisting and writhing as though alive. The hum was overwhelming now, vibrating through her chest, her skull, her very bones. She fell to her knees, her hands pressed against the rough, pulsating surface. And then, the voice returned. It wasn't distant this time. It was inside her, filling her mind with its guttural, alien words. They carved through her thoughts, burning themselves into her consciousness like searing brands. She could feel it now, not just the voice, but the presence behind it. It was watching her, studying her, waiting. The symbols on the structure flared brightly, and the ground beneath her shifted again, rising and falling like the chest of some enormous beast. The voice grew louder, more insistent, and she felt something else now, something moving beneath the surface. A hand erupted from the ground in front of her, pale and skeletal, its fingers impossibly long and tipped with jagged claws. Another hand followed, and then another, until dozens of them were clawing their way out of the pulsing floor. They weren't human. Their proportions were all wrong, their skin stretched too tight over their bones, their mouths wide and full of jagged teeth. They didn't attack her. Instead, they reached for the structure, their clawed hands pressing against its surface as though in worship. The hum grew louder, the symbols flaring brighter, and Mara realized with dawning horror what was happening. The thing in the structure, it wasn't just alive. It was waking up. She tried to move, to crawl away, but the ground beneath her held her fast. The presence in her mind grew stronger, its voice a deafening roar now, and she felt herself being pulled closer to the structure. The hands turned toward her, their jagged claws reaching out, and she screamed. The last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her was the structure splitting open, revealing something inside, something vast and ancient, its eyes glowing with a sickly light that burned into her soul. The structure split widened, and the thing inside began to emerge. Mara couldn't comprehend its full shape, it was too vast, too alien, its body twisting and writhing, as though it existed in dimensions her mind couldn't grasp. What little she could see made her wish she couldn't. Tendrils that glistened with a viscous, black ichor eyes that blinked in impossible patterns, their glow searing her vision. A mouth, or was it mouths? Lined with jagged, shifting teeth that clicked and ground together like stone. The claws that had erupted from the floor weren't trying to harm her. They were ushering her closer, dragging her toward the pulsating structure, as though she were an offering. She thrashed against the invisible force that held her, her screams swallowed by the deafening roar that now filled the cavern. The thing's eyes locked onto her, and she felt it invade her mind, not as a voice this time, but as a presence, vast and overwhelming. It wasn't speaking to her. It was devouring her thoughts, stripping away every memory, every shred of individuality, until she was laid bare before it. Her knees hit the ground as the tendrils began to unfurl, reaching toward her with a slow, deliberate inevitability. She clawed at the floor, desperate to pull herself away, but her hands sank into the soft, fleshy surface. It yielded beneath her fingers, pulsing and oozing, and she realized with mounting horror that it was alive. Everything here was alive. The tendrils brushed against her skin, cold and slick, sending a jolt of pain through her body. They coiled around her arms, her legs, pulling her closer to the thing at the center of the cavern. Her screams turned to sobs, her strength fading as the presence in her mind grew stronger, suffocating her. And then, just as she thought she couldn't take it anymore, the tendrils stopped. The thing froze, its many eyes narrowing as though it had noticed something. For a moment the cavern was silent except for the wet, rhythmic pulsing of the ground beneath her. The claws, the tendrils, the shapes that had been circling her, they all turned their attention toward the thing inside the structure, waiting. Mara didn't understand what was happening, but she felt the shift in the air, the tension thick enough to choke on. The thing tilted its vast, amorphous head, its glowing eyes fixed on her. And then it spoke. Not in the guttural, alien language that had seared her mind before. It spoke in her voice. Mara. The sound was perfect, an exact replica of her own voice, but twisted, mocking. Hearing it sent a wave of nausea crashing over her. The thing laughed, the sound low and rumbling, and she realized with dawning horror that it wasn't just repeating her voice, it was mimicking her thoughts. You don't know what you've done, it said, still using her voice. You don't know what you are. She shook her head, trying to block it out, but the words burrowed into her skull. Images flashed before her eyes, memories, dreams, fragments of thoughts she didn't even remember having. The thing was sifting through her mind, picking it apart piece by piece. You opened the door, it said, its voice shifting now, growing deeper, more distorted. You let me out. She realized with a sickening lurch that it wasn't waking up. It was escaping. The structure wasn't a prison. It was a barrier, a seal meant to contain it, and she had broken it. The tendrils tightened around her, pulling her closer to the thing's shifting, writhing mass. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The air was thick with the stench of decay and the weight of the thing's presence, pressing down on her from all sides. The glowing symbols on the structure began to fade, their light flickering and dying one by one. As the last symbol went dark, the thing's form began to expand, spreading out like smoke, like darkness itself. The tendrils dissolved into the air, and the claws retreated, but the presence didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger, more oppressive, filling every inch of the cavern. And then it spoke again, its voice echoing inside her skull. You are mine now. Mara's vision blurred, her mind fracturing under the weight of the words. She felt herself falling again, not into the cavern, but into something deeper, something endless. The last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her was the thing's glowing eyes, watching her with a hunger that would never be sated. When she woke, she was lying on the floor of the basement. The flashlight was still clutched in her hand, its beam flickering weakly against the concrete wall. The basement was small again, the way it had been the first time she'd gone down. The air was still and quiet, the oppressive presence gone. But she wasn't alone. In the farthest corner of the basement, where the stain had been, a figure stood. It was human-shaped, but its features were all wrong, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It only watched her, its glowing eyes the only source of light in the room. And deep in her mind she heard the voice again. You opened the door. Mara scrambled to her feet, backing away from the figure, but the basement door was gone. There was no way out. The walls began to close in, the space growing smaller and smaller, until the figure was inches away from her. She could feel its breath now, cold and damp against her skin, and as it reached out toward her, she realized with a sickening certainty that she would never leave this place. The last thing she heard was her own voice, whispering softly in her ear. You are mine now.